I love big projects that are in-depth and serious, with a lowercase s, that require a considerable amount of research because that's the way my brain works and it keeps me off the streets and out of prison. An occupied mind is, not the devil's plaything.
Hello and welcome to the MO Podcast. My name is Jonathan Neal and I'm here as always with my co-host Joey Flores. And today we are very happy to welcome Alexis Rockman to the podcast. Alexis is a one-time New York City, now Connecticut-based artist whose practice has addressed the human impact on the Earth's climate, environment, its plants and animals since at least the 1980s. His work can be found in nearly every major U.S. museum in the United States and many around the world. I'm not going to even go close to just trying to list them all. It's one of those stupid things. If you're interested, you can look it up. Major recent projects include the Great Lakes Cycle, which was an exhibition of large-scale paintings, watercolors, field drawings that toured the Midwest. Between 2018 and 2020, he had an exhibition of works based on shipwrecks that opened at the Peabody Essex Museum, went to Guildhall, the Ackland Art Museum, Princeton University Art Museum between 2021 and 2022. One of the projects we're going to talk about today appeared at the Mystic Seaport Museum in 2023. This is a work called Oceanus, or an exhibition called Oceanus, but a large 18 by 24 foot panoramic painting, very much in the tradition of event paintings by people like John Martin, Jericho, Thomas Cole, and others. Recently, just opened at the Tang Museum in Skidmore, is Journey to Nature's Underworld, which is a big joint exhibition between Alexis and his longtime friend and collaborator, Mark Dion, which we'll talk about a little bit hopefully today as well. That will travel to the museums at the University of Miami and then Penn State next year. And he has a brand new show of work opening at Magenta Plains in New York City on January 16th. I just saw the announcement of that go out, which will be running through March. I know there are a lot of other projects in the works that we will get to talk about today as well. But Alexis, welcome to the MO Podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great. First thing I feel like I have to ask is, how are you feeling after the election?
Fucking terrible. Every day unfolds a stranger and more improbable wrinkle on this crash that we're watching, not only politically, but environmentally and human rights. And I'm glad I'm not in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. So I expected that answer from you, but I'm curious. So what are your sort of biggest fears for this administration? What were some of the positive things that you saw the previous administration doing? Sort of what would be some of the policy shifts that you are expecting to see? I know that you pay attention to some of this, more and less closely. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on some of what this looks like coming out of Washington, D.C.
Well, the thing about Trump is he really telegraphs what he's going to do. And if you don't believe him, you're a fool. And everything he said is a disaster environmentally, leaving the Paris Accord, starting to, open federal lands to drilling. I mean, the list could go on. I don't even know where to begin. That's like an onion that has no end. Now, to be fair to Biden, who, there's plenty of criticism to go around, especially Monday morning quarterbacking when you get your ass kicked in an election, is that, he did a tremendous amount of positive things for the environmental world. And listen, best case scenario, it's going to be a tremendous struggle. But with Trump in office, all bets are off. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that, doomsday ice sheet leaves Antarctica in the next 4 years. Nothing surprises me, and I'm continuously shocked.
Well, at least Trump would probably grotesquely take credit for it in some way.
For him. God bless America. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm not, I don't have a unique position on this, and I'm no original thinker.
Right. So moving over to sort of more, let's say, more artistic concerns. One of the things that we like to talk about on the MO podcast are sort of big
ambition. What does MO stand for, by the way?
Anything you wanted to. We began at like modus operandi,
Okay, I got it. Yeah.
but then it sort of switched into things like more opinions and magnum opus. And
Sure.
Joey, what are some of the others that we've there were another couple that came up even during conversations with some of our guests that we hadn't even thought of.
Major objectives,
Yeah,
All
massive.
good.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, we actually got a graphic on our podcast main page that has at least a dozen
Oh, okay.
MO phrases that we kept it purposefully ambiguous.
When you can't come up with the name of just yet another podcast, and so
We
we feel
can't
like
complain. Like, what the hell
yeah.
does it mean?
Yeah, exactly. Just got, figure that a pair of initials makes it easier to
Yep.
be all things to all people. But one of the things we do like to talk about are, for example, magnum opus type of works, large projects, big ambitious projects, things that require more than just, let's say, a month or two of conception and execution. I'd say for you, one of the big projects that debuted relatively recently, this project for the Mystic Seaport Museum, the painting Oceanus, large 24-foot long panoramic painting, similar in scale and format to other works that you've done over the course of your career. So you have a kind of track record of executing at scale like this. But I'm sort of curious, we can use this work as a sort of specific concrete example to walk through. How do projects like that for you come about, right? Do you always have one of those sort of germinating in the background things that you want to execute, or is it something that comes about more in conversations with institutions, patrons, people who are able to help underwrite a project like that? What's the sort of genesis of those types of large scale projects?
Originally in 1992, I had a studio visit with the incredibly visionary dealer Genenzo Speroni. I was 30 years old and had been successful for about 4 years or so, and was feeling, pretty positive about my career. And he came to my studio, and I was thrilled because he was a partner in one of the greatest galleries of the era, and they're still going strong, Speroni Westwater. And he looked at what I considered to be an impossibly large painting of mine and said, "This should be the size of the wall." And he pointed to my studio wall at the time on Franklin Street in Tribeca, and it was about 25 feet long. And he said, "How much would it cost to make a painting that big?" And I mentioned something probably low, idiotically low, because I was too scared. And he said, "Sure, well, why don't we do that in monthly payments? And, we can show it at the gallery in September." And this was about February. Yeah, I'd say February. And his belief in me was just the springboard to thinking about this is obviously before the digital era, and like, what is the point of seeing art in person? And one of the things you can do is shifts in scale, make things enormous. Kiefer Rosenquist, I was familiar with all those painters at the time, Julian Schnabel. What's the idea about using scale as a springboard for the reward of leaving your house? And at that point, there were magazines, no digital or phones or anything like that. And I, over the years, realized that was something that was really fascinating. It checked a number of boxes. One being, I love big projects that are in-depth and serious, with a lowercase s. That require a considerable amount of research, because that's the way my brain works, and it keeps me off the streets and out of prison. An occupied mind is, not the devil's plaything. And also economically, I found a way to find, people that had like-minded and interested in institutions or collectors that would reward me for taking that leap. It's not really a good idea to do that on spec, because
Right.
it require a couple of years. So I have maybe made 15 paintings around that size. I have a couple in the pipeline now that I would love to see happen. One is at the Jewish Museum, which I think is going to happen. Who knows? There will be Civilization in 2028 when it's scheduled to debut. And the way that happened was I was talking to James Snyder, who, before he was the director of the museum, about this idea I had about the history of the Middle East and agriculture and the Fertile Crescent. And he suggested some places in Israel, and then the war broke out, and that was dead. And then he surfaced at the Jewish Museum and asked me if I wanted to do the project there. And I said, basically, fuck yeah.
Nice. And so when you're, think about like, so for Oceanus, since that's the one that's most recent, how long does a work like that take you to execute the large panoramic painting? I know
Yeah.
there's a whole suite of things that go alongside of that, but how
Well,
long does it take you to
I
execute
got
something like that?
an email from Christina Conant Brophy, who is I don't know, I can't remember her official title, but deputy director and chief curator. And she had been the director of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and I'd been in touch with her about the shipwreck cycle before
Series. Yep.
COVID broke out, and I never got a chance to go up there because of that pandemic. And she said, I just arrived at the Mystic Seaport Museum, and do you have any ideas about a project that you could do like Manifest Destiny, which is now in the Smithsonian, that debuted in the Brooklyn Museum 20 years ago? And I said, well, absolutely. After a conversation, I said, well, why don't I do something about your collection of watercraft and make a project, a big painting from the perspective of the things that were exploited by those boats and make portraits of those boats. And I think there's about 30 of them in the painting. And it was just a fantastic project because they have an education department, they have curators, they have a collection. It was just a really, so many of the people that worked there were so generous, and it turned out fantastic.
How long did it take you to actually execute the painting
Say
itself?
about 3 years.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
from research to,
That's from the email until the painting
until
began.
the painting went on display. Right.
No, I'd say until it was finished. I think there was
Until it's
another.
finished.
It had to be finished early because we did a book,
Right.
A Rizzoli exhibition. It's not really a catalog; it's a book about the projects. And during that period, I was talking to the author, the writers for that book, and the designer, and there was a book producer and so on. So that I brought onto the project.
Now, I remember that, sorry, I remember, I visited you at that studio in Franklin Street. It was not a huge studio. I mean, you had like one, 25-foot wall. It's pretty constrained. When you execute a big project like that, though, you do them in panels. Panels come together. It's not all sort of one thing. And
Right.
I think I remember seeing a picture of you at some point. Maybe this is in your new studio in Connecticut, where you actually sort of built a kind of armature that allowed you to work on the ground, and you sort of have you lying down on this armature like across these large panels to be able to do these big things.
I think you're confusing me with a photograph of Richter scene, but I did have that the Oceanus project had to be broken into panels, separate pieces. It was in two pieces for a while. I think it eventually was in six individual panels that went into a crate. So it wasn't this unwieldy thing. But the way I've been making paintings the last decade is very much, they start out very fluid and very much like a giant watercolor. And in order to get the material on the surface of the painting, you have to sort of be over it. But because the structure is too fragile to stand on it, I was very lucky that the preparator at the Mystic Seaport Museum built that thing for me after having a conversation with him. So that was his ingenuity.
Interesting. Is that the first time that you
Yes.
kind of worked
I
that
still
worked
have
that
it.
way?
It's in my downstairs storage, and I'm sure I'll use it again.
You have to use it again if you do another one of these large scale
Sure.
projects. Yeah.
Yeah.
And did that change the way that, let's say, from Manifest Destiny and some of the earlier sort of, let's say, epic panorama paintings, was that mechanism of being able to sort of work horizontally, work, more fluidly at the beginning, it sort of changed the nature of the painting itself? Has there been like a shift in actually the technical approach to painting?
That's been sort of unilateral, and the Oceanus painting is certainly the largest of those paintings. But that's something after I finished Manifest Destiny, which I worked on for 4 years, not exclusively, I did other things during that period too, but there were so many tedious moments of, architectural vanishing points and perspectival devices of, to be clear to your wonderful listeners and viewers, that is a project about what melting ice caps are going to do to Brooklyn, looking from the shore of the East River of Manhattan underwater. And it was originally a commission for the Brooklyn Museum, and they sort of had whatever, it's a long story, but they backed out of it as a commission economically, but it debuted there when they reopened in 2004. But I was so sick of painting windows in perspective, I started to get out the damn palette knife and start to throw paint around after that.
Interesting. And so, and you think that
It was a
that's
reaction.
Yeah, yeah. And so, that's, because there is a kind of there's a kind of liquid
Yeah.
mentality that has kind of taken over the last like 10, 15 years in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I'm a firm believer in, the non-linguistic or non-verbal parts. I mean, obviously painting is non-verbal. And, the term onomatopoeia, where the delivery system of information mimics what's being described or has a relationship to it. If you're doing stuff about, biology or melting ice caps or organic material that's being eaten or a pile of shit, if it's oozing and dripping as
Right.
paint, that's another layer of meaning and another opportunity to, have fun.
Right. A more appropriate echo of the thing itself.
Right.
Yeah. Nice.
Alexis, I'm curious. My handicap as an artist is like I can't do anything without a reference photo, and obviously the whole scenes that you create are like massive, and despite being very realistic or like obviously from your imagination. Like, what is your process for designing the painting, capturing that photorealism? Like, what is the planning process like in terms of do you have reference material that you're looking at?
First of all, I look at I'm omnivorous. I constantly looking for images or whatever. But the thing that I try to do is I do create reference in Photoshop that is relatively crude. And I give myself opportunities to explore things that aren't possible. I mean, Photoshop is a tool and I have nothing against it, but it's like AI. It tends to run out of its charm after a while for me. And I use it as a springboard so that I'm basically at a point in the Photoshop document where I have enough information that if I go any further, I won't want to make the painting. I get what I'm really sort of, it's a Swiss Army knife approach to reference. I just do what I need. And there's a tool there somehow. For instance, if I have, a painting of a series of dinosaurs from the Tethys Sea that was part of the Central Europe, you can see that orange painting on that I'm pointing to. There's a series of, and it's based on the fossil record. I would look at cycads. I would look at reconstructions of ichthyosaurs that were found as fossils in that area, pterosaurs, and then I would go look at illustrations or dioramas of those things and try to get pieces of information together that create a compelling situation that I want to investigate as a painting. That's it. And I'm interested in scientific accuracy to a point, or no, I'm interested in scientific accuracy. But once I'm making the painting, I'm not thinking about that stuff. It's all about painting. It's kind of like two steps.
You mentioned some of these paintings take 3 and 4 years. Do you ever find yourself halfway through a project and you're just tired of working on this piece?
All the time, but tough shit. What are my options? Go get a job?
When you say the attention turns to the painting, what does that look like to you in terms of the kinds of problems you're trying to solve or the thing that the painting is trying to do?
I'm having an internal conversation with everyone from Enser to, everyone that Victor Hugo. These are all like things that are swirling around. And as the painting starts to develop, I start to find avenues into pushing it in certain ways and pulling it in other ways. And I'm talking to, Courbet or whatever. I'm just having a great time thinking about painting. And I do parts of them very quickly. I would say that a good 90% of the surface of the painting is done in an afternoon because it's like being an athlete. I'm prepared. I'm giving myself opportunities for interesting painting that I have done before, but I've never seen before. And I'm trying to balance these things. There's a real sense of hysterical desperation. A third of the way into the painting, I'm convinced it's a piece of shit and somehow pull it together.
So do you find yourself, you have a kind of Rolodex or an index of pictures and references and things in your mind that you don't think about, almost intellectually, but you think about them in terms of like how they're executed as paintings, right? So like the Courbet example. And so you think about, the like late landscape, big, sort of water, or, paintings, and you've got, right, you've got like a sort of image of how those brushstrokes. So when you go and see works, you're the kind of artist who's like constantly trying to figure out how that mark was made, how that effect was produced.
Was it wet over dry, wet into wet, stuff
right.
like that. time.
What,
Go ahead.
from a technique standpoint, are there things on your radar that like challenges that you want to give to yourself, or new, maybe like besides just generally being better all the time? Like, is there like technique type stuff that you're like, yeah, I want to tackle that at some point, or like there's like new approaches that are, that you have the preconceived notion, like I've never done X before and I want to try that.
I don't want to come off as sort of arrogant, but I can't think of anything that I haven't at least dip my pinky into that I've been doing this. So I just want to do more and be better. That's whatever that means. And I think my idea of being better at this point is that sort of wonderful space in between credibility and so-called competence and the craziness of the unexpected that you could never think of.
Do you ever paint things that are completely out of the wheelhouse of your public facing art practice and like just make something for yourself that's like, some abstract work, or, like anything that you're just like, I'm just going to make this like wild
I'm so
picture.
selfish and self-involved. I could care less about anyone else, and I'm always painting for myself.
But I guess I mean, like, are they all of the same vein?
There's no secret body of work with, that have to do with, no, there's no secret. I know some artists have secret bodies of work and I can't say who they are. And that to me, I'm so pathetic. It's like, how can you not integrate that into what you're doing?
So in a way, I'm sort of disappointed, Alexis. I wish there was like a whole series of like very sentimental portrait paintings of like friends and family that were just like straight up, as opposed to these kind of like
everything I can think of would be run out of town in every world. So I'm not going to say.
Well, it's interesting. So, I mean, one of the things that you've been a sort of omnivorous and voracious consumer and observer of is our sort of existing climate, our existing environments, and you sort of pushed and pulled those in various different directions, both from a sort of temporal standpoint, sort of mixing both deep history and deep time with, a sort of recent and imagined futures of what could be happening. I'm curious if you've ever thought to sort of transfer some of those thoughts off-world, given your interest in science fiction and your interest in other things. I mean, I know you've got the early set of paintings that made use of, for example, images from Silent Running and the idea of, of flora and fauna being sort of captured in a kind of outer space environment. And there was a real kind of science fiction element, at an earlier period of your career. And given now the sort of like extraordinary images that we have and a lot of the kind of information that is coming in about the climates and environments of other planets and other places, I'm sort of curious if you've ever thought to address your work to those types of spaces. Given that in the next 4 years we might be colonizing Mars.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm not even going to laugh at that. I got to a point where I realized that, or my position on those things, and I think science fiction is one of the great genres of when science fiction and what I saw unfolding in the world became almost indistinguishable. I kind of lost interest in that. That would be like, wanting to, I have this idea for a show. It's called A Handmaid's Tale. Why even do that when it's anyway, there's so much happening in the world that I'm interested in making work about that has lost its allure since the world has gone, crazy.
Interesting. Because it seems that, on the one hand, there was a kind of moment, I don't know, like the 50s and the 60s, maybe early 70s, which is a real kind of maybe an economic and ideological sort of transformative moment, late Cold War kind of movement from a previous sort of economic scenario into something closer to the kind of neoliberal world that everyone thinks that we live in today, which seemed to be very productive from a science fiction standpoint, right? There was a kind of, one after another, a number of movies and a lot of popular culture and even writing that came out that really seemed to sort of push the boundaries of what we could explore. And then since then, everything has kind of been zombies. Everything has been a kind of retrenchment to a kind of, what does the world look like? Imagining the world after humanity in some sense, or
dystopian science fiction, sure.
Yeah, the kind of reign of dystopian science fiction, and it doesn't mean that you have to have like a it doesn't mean that it has to be a sort of utopian science fiction, but just like the capacity to imagine or be a world builder in a different way is, slightly different today than it was. I would hate to call your work kind of dystopian landscape.
I'm just a
But
documentarian.
yeah, exactly. It's all real. But there's a sense in which your capacity to sort of imagine these things, you've built up such an internal kind of operating system that allows you to push the various different degrees of freedom of the way this stuff can show up. I would sort of be very curious to see how it manifests, given the sort of imagery, given the sort of capacity to imagine what, like, just the sort of the haywire nature of what it would look like on Mars, or what the underwater environment of Europa actually is once this probe that was launched by NASA makes it out there and
That is
decides whether there might be life underneath
very
underneath
fascinating.
the ice surface. And
Yeah.
if there's a way of thinking, like, I mean, if there's a painter who could sort of imagine those things or has something to say about it, it might be you.
Oh, well, that's kind of you. I mean, I think that, the idea of sending a probe to Europa is really one of the more fascinating things possible, and, fingers crossed. But I'll tell you a story. I mean, first of all, I think all this stuff is interesting, and I love the idea of making work about science fiction. I just haven't found the way into that, or whatever thread or door is opened to whatever I'm doing. It's not about that. But I'll tell you a story about something I'm working on right now that it kind of overlaps with what you're talking about. About a month ago, I got an email asking me if I wanted to do the next Earth Day poster for 2025. It's their 55th anniversary. It's a big deal to them. And as you know, Earth Day is a so-called celebration of the rest of life on Earth besides humans. So I said, absolutely. What do you have in mind? And they said, well, we want something that's uplifting and about renewable energy. And I internally said, are you fucking crazy? This is a month ago. And we went back and forth, and I understood. I was about to walk away. And then my wife, Dorothy, said, you're not going to get this chance again. Try to make this work in whatever way you can. And I went back to them with a couple of ideas, and I talked to an illustrator friend of mine, because, to be clear, I'm the, scorched earth type of visionary, not the, kumbaya type of visionary. And I talked to an illustrator friend of mine, Scott Mention, and I told him this conundrum. And he said, well, what if you did this, that, and this? And I said, oh, that's really interesting. And he sent me a couple of drawings, and I was like, now I know why he's a professional and one of the great illustrators in the world, because it's really an illustration problem, this. So I went back to them with this idea. And in the meantime, the election unfolded. And then I heard crickets for 2 weeks. And they said, we need to regroup. This is a horror show. So yesterday I wrote back to them, and they said, oh, we actually really love your new idea. And I have a couple of questions, X, Y, and Z. So what I'm saying is that there's all sorts of ways I'm very much of a path of least resistance type of project generator. If I get an interesting email or a phone call from someone, I'm more than happy to do. Also, I have so many ideas that I would love to get involved with it. It's apples and oranges. Who cares? It's all good.
Sure. I wanted to ask you recently, this is a little bit more of a philosophical question, but so I was watching, I've got 2 children, one of them's young, 6 years old. We were watching the series Life on Our Planet, right? One of these great sort of
David Attenborough.
yeah, well, is it Attenborough, but it's a Morgan Freeman narrated
Okay.
documentary.
Yeah,
that,
no, I
like,
get
was,
the idea.
that was like it was takes a lot of the research that's been done about the various different phases of life on Earth at different deep periods of history,
Extinction
where
events.
Fifth
yeah,
extinction.
large extinction events and things, and the changing and already the sort of radically changing climate of the planet over the periods of time, from ice ages to hot and what have you.
Policy.
It's a beautifully done thing. Morgan Freeman is
The voice of God.
yeah, the voice of God is the narrator. It's very compelling. The animation is very good, so it's like, I mean, it's like one of these things that takes what you used to have, just sort of like stop motion dinosaurs, which would capture our attentions when we were children, to now these things that are like really sort of remarkably, strangely lifelike.
Real CGI.
Yeah, it's really good,
Absolutely.
but one of the things that struck me as being kind of a curious sort of counter lesson that it's teaching is that over long time periods, right? Over these sort of extreme time horizons, the planet has gone through these phases where, 95% of the life has disappeared.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then has returned in various different phases and allowed for sort of new modes of evolution, new life to take hold, adapts to sort of new conditions, what have you.
Yeah.
If I am a 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 15-year-old watching these things, and then someone's coming to me about needing to deal with climate change, make radical decisions about changes of energy policy,
Painful
resource
decision.
extraction, all these kinds of painful decisions about the way that humans, affect their co-inhabitants and the environments of planet Earth. Isn't it enough for someone to point to and be like, look, none of us are going to be here in 500,000 years, but the Earth will be. So what are we really concerned about? Right? What are we really sort of challenged about? Isn't this not just another exercise in a kind of self-importance and a kind of anthropocentric view of what it is that we are either responsible for morally or ethically, or how it is we're meant to be, stewarding or managing the land? Shouldn't we just be doing kind of what it is that we want to be doing, to the extent that we think it's important, and give up on the kind of the idea that we have control over what's happening?
Well, I mean, if you want to, justify murder, rape, or any other human behavior that humans
But
want to do, I think that's a perfectly viable. And if you look back into the 19th century or the turn of the 20th century, and Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir are talking about the future of America, and no one had set aside the national parks. I'm just talking about America. We would be basically living in a wasteland now. The conceit is that, apologists for human behavior generally have their pocketbooks in mind. Not saying yours is more of a, your conversation just now is really, I think, a provocative springboard to having this conversation. Now, I think that, if you care about biodiversity, if you care about having water to drink and air to breathe, you care about conservation on one level. If you want to give, the fossil fuel industry the green light, which is going to have in reality for the next 4 years, you are going to seriously impact all these things that I value and I consider to be our moral responsibility, which is taking whatever biodiversity we still have and cherishing it. Clean water. I mean, I have clean water here because I have a well, but that's, not guaranteed to other people. If there's environmental destruction, that'll certainly go into the clean water areas. Now, of course, if you're in Florida, you're going to have serious problems once salt water gets into the aquifer. And so all these things are ridiculous, apology to make money.
sure.
I'm just gonna add. I've seen that series on Netflix, which is incredible, like really, really good. But I think one thing that's very different is that these other extinction events that happened over time was like a meteor hits the Earth and within days everything is dead, right? Or so like a lot of these, or a volcano explodes and fills the sky with black and everything dies within a matter of weeks or what have you. But I think like what's very different about the crisis that we face is that it's going to be a very slow, long, painful process.
I actually have to
Alexis was
contradict that in two directions, because the KT meteor asteroid was relatively fast, but the Permian could have been 200,000 years unfolding, because it was a series of volcanic eruptions. CO2 was released, and the theory holding now is that it was a number of volcanoes. So this, our sixth extinction that we've been involved with has really been since humans left Central Africa, right? Wherever humans have gone, they went up through the Middle East. Some made a left turn, went into Europe. Some made a right turn, went into Asia, and then eventually down to Australia about 200,000 years ago. Wherever humans went, death and destruction followed, right? All these enormous extinctions, the Pleistocene or Ice Age, whatever you want to call it, definitely a combination of human hunting activity and all sorts of other things. So that is 200,000 years fast. I mean, we can go back 100 years, but the dodo went extinct, I think, in 1642, something like that. thylacine in 1936. So this has been an unfolding project that we're very good at.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, I mean, because I was just kind of getting at this idea. I don't hear too many people talk about, I mean, well, maybe they do, but, the small, not many crises, but the different crises that are going to happen as things get worse, whether it's, the increased hurricane power and destruction, whether it's, more frequent tornadoes,
Storms.
or whatever else.
And storms.
Right. It just feels like, we, even if we think, well, the world will still be here and maybe humans won't survive, or maybe a handful will, and they'll repopulate the earth. And so is it really so bad because, this happens every few million years or whatever? Anyways, it's like, let's not ignore the fact that,
I mean, I wouldn't have
to
kids.
live in this like hellscape,
I wouldn't have kids because of this. I mean, my wife had 2 sons, and I'm thrilled to have been in their lives, but I couldn't bring a kid into this world.
Well, I was actually gonna raise that because it's that is one of the responses to this sort of current challenge, right?
There's people around.
There's this, but they're the same people that are, one set of people worried about the human effect on the climate and the environment and on the species that we share the planet with. The others about population collapse and that bringing about the same, but that's bringing about the same kind of horrors or the same kind of degradations that ultimately people seem to be most concerned about as well with regard to potential environmental and habitat collapse.
I don't know what the problem with having less people is. Tell me. Please explain that.
I totally agree.
That you don't see the problem with having less people?
No.
So I'm not an expert on this, so I'm gonna stumble through it, and then maybe some of our listeners, or we'll have to have a follow-up episode on it. But
gonna get a lot of that.
So the way that I do understand it is that, ultimately a lot of what we sort of rely on from a sort of economic and social standpoint requires sort of baseline reproduction of the human species, right? To like keep the supply chains running, to keep the services running that we expect, to keep the sort of, the amount of food that is necessary to be produced and everything else, right? And this is sort of globally, not just in the United States, where things like agriculture now requires 2% of the, labor power that it once did 100 years ago, and so on and so forth. The assumption being that population decline won't have the effect that we think it will have because technology can be put in place to make things as efficient where they are. But the argument being that the speed with which that population collapse is happening, there won't be enough capacity to generate, build, distribute the technology needed for the types of productivity and efficiencies. And thus you'll end up having, it'll be faster to famines, faster to social breakdown, just for this standpoint of like, what if you don't have enough people to be police officers, you don't have enough people being fire departments, you don't have enough people being doctors, you don't have enough people providing sort of basic health and human services that we take for a baseline level of civilization. With a certain level of population collapse, that all stuff gets strained to the maximum. Those resources flow to the wealthy anyway. The rest of humanity is left out in the cold, and it becomes the kind of hellscape that, one imagines living through in a kind of habitat collapse scenario too. Now, I may be missing things. Again, I probably got that narrative wrong, but this is one of the dystopian scenarios that is being put forward. What's that?
Sounds like someone wants to fuck.
It does, right? But it's not trivial, right? Like you talk to the folks, or you read the pieces from the folks who study this type of thing, and at current, let's say, we all think about it, it's like, oh, well, we shouldn't be consuming as much, we shouldn't be doing the kinds of things that we're doing right now if we want to have this kind of self-sustaining planet. But that's at the same time, it's like, okay, well, you like having your studio with the the lights on and you're well, and you like being able to drive your car down to New York City and go to a restaurant and all those types of things. It's like, we're talking about some future where it's like, no, all of a sudden everybody's, back to 80% of their labor, trying to maintain their self-sustaining farms around their local communities. And, electricity has to be got by, a windmill that doesn't turn, or, who's going to be producing the solar panels in the future that are going to be, generating the renewable electricity, so on and so forth.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll say two things.
I don't know
One,
what you're
it
talking
basically
about.
sounds like it basically
You guys are
sounds
just
like
denialists. This is
Sounds
just
like you're like a
denialism.
Mormon that wants to fucking have
Population denialism.
it sounds to
Sounds like
me,
Elon Musk talking.
I feel like you're implying that human civilization is just one big Ponzi scheme, and that like
Might
if we
be.
don't get the next generation of suckers to come in and buy in, then the whole thing falls apart.
I don't know. It's or you call it social security.
I mean, I've been vegan for 20 years now, and this sounds really similar also to the argument that like, well, we can't stop eating meat because then there would be all these billions of animals that need to be taken care of, and whatever else, and people act like it would be such a sudden change that we would have no way of dealing with it, as opposed to like a gradual decline. So like, it just feels, I don't know. That makes sense.
I think Trump is going to do far more damage with all of this stuff that you're scared of, Jonathan, in the next year than we could ever do by, not keeping the population up. So my priorities are elsewhere.
Understood.
Alexis, if you could be commissioned to create any large scale painting of the kind that you're known for, is there a specific crisis or region or whatever that like you feel like might be hard to get
LA support? Baby, come on, right?
Yeah,
right.
LA.
Okay, yes, that I knew. So the tar pits and everything. Yeah, that would be
that's just part of it. There's so many interesting things, from the use of water, the fire problems, the fossil record, what it looked like before the water was stolen from or taken from the Colorado River. The fascinating animals that used to live there, all sorts of. That would be great.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to see that happen.
Me too.
I want to see Mars.
What the fuck? Who cares about Mars? That shit's dead. Go look at The Martian, Ridley Scott's Martian. That's close as you're gonna get.
I watched it.
Don't go
Alexis,
there.
Do you feel like, given the conflict about climate change, does your work get politicized? And what are some of the best, most rewarding interactions that you've seen happen with your work versus things that like really pissed you off?
Nothing ever really happens. Podcasts. I've tried. No one cares about art in America. Not the magazine. It is so toothless. I've really turned my attention in terms of that activist thing into film stuff. And that's been, a mixed bag also, but I'm working on a couple of things. But I have never had a shouting match or a confrontation or any of that good shit. I wish I had.
You should try beaching a fake whale sometime.
There's enough real ones. That's too like Bobby Kennedy.
We had an interview on our podcast with a group called the Captain Boomer Collective, and they created an actual life-size replica of a beach whale, and they go in the dark of night and install it on the beach and pretend to be scientists collecting samples, and people like gather around. And when some people find out they've been duped into this, they react quite violently.
That sounds kind of interesting, but
it must be. It must be a function of us having had that like on the podcast or had been in my email feed or something like that, because now I'm getting fed on the Instagram algorithm all of these videos that show these AI generated large scale whales and giant squid, octopus, like, that have washed up on shore.
People have sent me those thinking they're real. And
yeah, they are. It's great because there is this kind of, there's this moment you look at it and you're like, of course that's not real. But they, the
amazing,
the fidelity of the images itself are quite good, right? It's very enjoyable to look at.
Sooner than later, you won't be able to tell the difference, and that's going to be interesting.
On some of the stuff that's already happening.
Yeah, it occurs to me that like one of the things that your work does is combines these kinds of different temporalities, right? That like you have the capacity of sort of, situating someone in the future, looking at the effects of history on a sort of a speculative future. And then there's sort of other moments of, say even more recently, the Calvin glaciers that situate someone in a past moment or a particular moment. So we're looking at
for my next show,
a breaching whale.
Breaching whale. It's called Post-Human.
Wow.
Villa Dalla Ana. And it's see that building on the right? That is a famous landmark in the Bay of Naples, in the neighborhood of Posillipo, as a ruin. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this was to imagine after humans and what would, the frolicking whale that's jumping for joy. So yes, time travel is one of the wonderful opportunities of making paintings, because you don't have to, the only thing that stops you is your own imagination.
And I've also noticed that the paintings that you've been making of late have the aspect ratio of a kind of widescreen film, of
Yes.
cinema.
Well, because I'm working on this panorama book and I see these history paintings. This is a cycle of paintings about Naples. It starts with Cretaceous, when there was a shallow sea. It goes through early humans and Neanderthals interacting, Vesuvius, plagues, overfishing, sea level rise. That's basically a cycle of paintings that are history paintings. It could be one painting, but it's 7 in this case. And it's all from those great mural-like paintings from Rudolf Zallinger and Charles Arnott of showing the age of dinosaurs chronologically and stuff like that. Who wouldn't want to make paintings like that the rest of their life? I know I would.
Alexis, maybe even on the smaller paintings, but certainly on the bigger ones. What role do like assistants play in helping you with that?
I don't have anyone helping me making paintings. I have a wonderful assistant named Alexander Winch, who I would say, give me a list of shit that lives on the slopes of Vesuvius, because I'm too lazy or preoccupied with something else to go look it up myself. And he's more patient than me.
Got it. So on the
List of
research side.
overfished fish in the Mediterranean in the last 50 years.
I see.
He'll give me the name and Latin name, and then I'll go figure. Then that's it.
Prior to the internet, how were you doing your research yourself?
National fucking Geographic, or going to the picture collection at the New York Public Library on 40th Street and 5th Avenue.
Jacques Cousteau. We're all old enough to remember Jacques Cousteau.
Of course. Dun, 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 dun. I just gave a lecture at the Art Institute of Chicago and showed a picture of Jacques Cousteau.
Nice.
As a hero. So yes, you're onto it. You're onto something.
Steve Zissou.
I hate that fucking movie.
Alexis, at some point, podcast interviews, magazine interviews, they all have to feel a little bit the same, I would imagine. You can answer.
No, because every day I wake up and I'm so excited to be thinking about what I'm thinking about, and really just so enthusiastic that I kind of forget. So it all feels fresh.
I'm curious whether it's about your practice, your techniques, or a particular painting, or an issue that you're focused on, or whatever. Like, what is a question you wish an interviewer would ask you? Something you've always felt like commenting on, but nobody ever asks you.
That exact question. I really don't know, Joe. There really is none. Why? Because it makes me get out of bed every morning instead of crying.
Do you have solar panels on your roof in Connecticut?
No. I live in an incredibly beautiful part of Litchfield County, but there is no access to solar panels here, or solar power, because we live in kind of a ravine, and there's a river that goes right next to my studio around the house, and there's a covered bridge that goes from my studio into the house. So no. It's oil, baby, oil. Burn, baby, burn. Drill, baby, drill. And I could be wearing my Just Stop Oil t-shirt and be a complete hypocrite. So there.
Well, that's right. It's kind of like being an artist and an activist, right? It's like,
right.
You have to inhabit your contradictions. You can't try and dispel them.
I cannot escape like anyone else.
What do you think the institutions, museums, cultural institutions, things like that? I mean, I think that the Mystic Seaport Museum is an interesting case study in this, because they create this big event painting. It's got, it has sort of crossovers with their education program. It's related to a whole different history that they're engaged with. But from the standpoint of the art museum itself, which of late is over the years trying to figure out what its rationale is supposed to be, what its purpose is supposed to be, above and beyond simply the sort of housing, collecting, conserving of what they think of as the important art of its time. The institutions themselves have taken on sort of activist stance. People think that they're a little bit more sort of political in their nature. What's your opinion on how the institutions should be addressing these types of things? I mean, do you see the museum similar to you, contradictorily, like can have a kind of an ethos that it is committed to, but its actual practice of what it's supposed to be doing should not be so directly involved in a kind of activist output?
That's such a complicated question, Jonathan. I don't know the answer to that, because I think that I revere institutional space. I grew up, my mom's an archaeologist. We went to museums, mostly of natural history, until I went to art school. So I revere the institutional space and have always longed to be one of the participants in the story of whatever the culture is at the time. I think that museums are also very vulnerable because they are made up of forces that are often economic, or most museums are terrified of getting into trouble and generally are defensive. And they buy work and they do projects. And listen, I am someone who's been incredibly lucky and well represented in museums. I may have had 50 museum shows over the last 40 years. And I consider myself an honor to be in those spaces too, but it doesn't escape me that many projects are the byproducts of these forces that are constantly fighting over resources and space and time in these institutions. And that includes trustees and curators, and everyone wants their pet project to be privileged. It's a flawed situation, though, as much as I revere it.
Yeah, go ahead,
To say
Joe.
nothing of where a lot of donor money comes from also. I mean,
Oh, there's no clean money, Joey. So I don't have any illusions of that. And, there are plenty of people that I'm appalled at what they do business-wise, and I'm happy to take their money.
I think that it's one of the conversations we had recently as well with another guest on the podcast, Melissa Cowley-Wolf, about efforts to attract a new generation of funders to these institutions, namely by making those institutions aligned with the other more, let's say, urgent issues, policies or politics that those funders are committed to. So, and I think climate is one of those, right? Climate is one that you've got a new generation of people coming out of, for example, Silicon Valley or other places. There's incredible sort of generational wealth coming online, and they will all say, okay, so here are sort of number one, number two, and number three, issues. How does the arts institutions and how do artists sort of, catch that wave in order to make themselves relevant? That's the word that gets used a lot, make themselves relevant to the interests and passions of this next generation of people who, I think, unlike a generation older than we are, a generation or two older than we are, were in their own way more committed to building civic society and culture as a function of that civic society. And so there was investment in the museum and cultural institution industry in some sense for its own sake, right? Because that's how you kind of, ensconced an elite culture that that needed some reflection of itself. These days, it's a little bit different. Doesn't feel quite the same, right? That money is flowing elsewhere, and so these institutions need to hitch their wagon to these other things. It strikes me that you've been doing this now for 40 years, right? You've had a practice that, at moments when I don't think that the art world had even mentioned the word climate or didn't know that there was anything like a climate crisis.
For 20 years.
Relevance is a funny thing. It's like relevance is something that you gain by having been committed to something that other people come to recognize at some point in the future, rather than simply trying to figure out which train is moving fastest and hitch your wagon to it.
Right. You want to be ahead of the curve, hopefully. I was lucky that I looked around when I was younger, and I first heard about climate change from a paleontologist who studied the Permian, which is about the largest extinction when 95% of life on Earth went extinct about 240 million years ago. I thought, wow, I am so lucky because this is a science fiction-y feeling idea. And there's so many, it's invisible other than using science fiction type of iconography. And that is something that I was already baked into my DNA, being a kid that grew up loving movies, and from Ray Harryhausen to 2001, and was obsessed with many genres, and thought, well, this is really a very serious. I had no clue it would unfold so quickly. But what a great thing as a painter to find something that no one else is interested in that is, exciting. And I can't think of anything more urgent.
Nice. We have a segment on the podcast we call More Opinions, a set of questions we normally ask most of the guests. So I'm going to ask you the More Opinions segment. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I'm going to start with you. I want to start with usually the one that we ask last, which is, Is there a work of art or another cultural artifact that if you could have it for yourself, right? If
I
you could
think about
steal
this
it,
every
take it.
day.
What's that?
I think about this every day.
Which work would you take to have for yourself? And it's like not like you have to like sequester it away in some private room that no one can ever see. You can show it to Dorothy, your wife,
I didn't
and a handful
steal
of
it.
other people.
It's been given to me.
No, you have to take it. It has to be something that doesn't belong to you. That has to be the value to you is enough that you have to risk life and limb and perpetual
I would love
shunning
a
from
Vermeer. I want a Vermeer. Anyone.
anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Watch out, Holland.
Seurat drawing.
You're never going to be invited to the Netherlands again.
Yeah. How about a Seurat drawing?
Or a Seurat drawing.
Yeah.
Too easy to get. I like Vermeer.
All right. He
Any
made like
Vermeer or any Seurat drawing.
paintings.
Why Seurat? Why a Seurat drawing?
Because they're fucking great. You know, the thing that there's so many things, Jonathan, but let's just stick to Vermeer.
Okay, Vermeer.
Next question.
Vermeer, I can understand. Vermeer, I can see it in a kind of perverse way the reason why that would appeal. All right, next question. And I think I can predict what the answer to this is going to be, but maybe not. So you have $10 million budget to start a company, organization, initiative, whatever you want it to be. It can't be related to your painting. It can't be related to the art world. It's got to be something totally separate. 10 million, it's not enough to like, stand up, something super big, but it's a fairly substantial amount of seed funding for some new project. What would you start?
To really answer that honestly, I can't because I need to do research.
Call your assistant. Directionally, what would you do it in?
Every time I think of what I would do, then I think of climate change and it undermines it. Something to do with it's not enough money to really be serious about anything but buys, land in Amazon rainforest and set it aside.
Okay. Conservation effort of some sort.
Tasmania, which is incredible, right?
Okay.
It's a tough question. That's a good question. They're both good questions.
And then final question, what's a project, another artist, or another sort of thing that you have seen recently that you'd like to bring more attention to? Something that somebody else is doing that you think is good. I'm going to say you can't say Mark Dion because you guys have been friends forever and you've been promoting each other's work for ages. So something that somebody else is doing that you think deserves attention, needs a shout out, and is worth people's time and attention.
I can't think of anything I think go see that Morandi show before it closes next week on 63rd Street.
Okay.
The painting show. It's getting enough attention and people love it, but it's still, you will never see these paintings again. It's like 80 works, 40 drawings and 50 paintings. And I've seen it twice.
When does it close?
It closes, I think, on the 26th.
Okay. I know this.
I'm not going to see it.
This episode may not drop in time for anybody to run out and go see it.
Jonathan,
so in that case, it's going to be very lamentable for people who are listening to this podcast.
I think you got to go to the
themselves.
Field Museum. Okay, here's one thing. I was just in Chicago and I spent a couple of hours at the Field Museum looking at Charles R. Knight's cycle of prehistoric life, which included both dinosaurs and extinct Ice Age mammals. And I thought I'd seen it until I got there. And first of all, my whole brain has been like formed by these paintings, but they were all through reproduction. Seeing them in person, it was so great. So no one goes to look at these paintings, and they were commissioned in between 1929 and 1930. And I think there's 20 of them or 40 of them. It's just incredible. Charles R. Knight, Field Museum, Chicago.
And those are the
gigantic.
Those are the paintings that are above the dioramas, right? That
they're above the fossils and the dioramas.
Right, and the dioramas, yeah.
And they're around. They're big paintings on canvas.
Right. So I grew up going to the Field Museum because I was born in Evanston, Illinois, and for the first 13 years of my life lived between Evanston and Chicago. And, one of the big weekend activities is to go down to these great museums like the Museum of Science and Industry and the Field and the Shedd Aquarium and everything. And so it's interesting because I have distinct memories of going to the Field Museum, but when you're a kid, you don't really see the paintings. You don't see the images so much because your attention is so drawn to all of Yeah, all the objects and the dioramas and those types of things. So even for someone who's lived there, this is still good advice to go and check it out because
So this painting,
I would need to go and see it again too.
it's those ammonites right here
Right.
are from a painting at the Field Museum that I'd never seen in person. I did this painting about 4 months ago, and to see it in real life was such a weird coincidence and revelation that it was great. I had no thought that I hadn't seen it until I got there. And I'm like, holy shit, I've never actually seen these in person. It's always been in some book.
Amazing. So for everybody who's just listening to this and isn't watching on YouTube, you sickos, Alexis is talking about a painting of looks like a beach whale. Theosaurus and some ammonites on a almost like a tropical island looking beach scene. But I will say, more importantly, you can go and see this painting, presumably going to be on display at Magenta Plains beginning on January 15th as part of Alexis's new 16th or 15th. Anyway, mid-January in New York City, a whole new suite of paintings that you will be able to go and see.
Right. Thank you for the plug.
Alexis, I think that'll do it for us. Thank you for joining the MO podcast.
Thank you for asking. And I'm confirming that this is going to be visually available also.
Absolutely.
Yes. Good thing I didn't show you that I'm in my underwear.
That just, we never ask people, tell people to arrange what they're wearing because,
Look at this. I got to show you, there's a painting. This is a painting of human encountering a Neanderthal. And guess who the human is?
I can't see close enough.
Pauly Shore.
No, that's not the human. I love that. It's Dorothy.
Is it Dorothy?
See how big, look at how, it's like, that's how big it is.
That looks like a reference to one of your earlier paintings, though.
Yes.
You have right? Isn't that an echo of that other...
Echo of romantic attachments.
Yeah, with that other Neanderthal with that...
That's a human ancestor that's called Homo georgicus.
There you go. Look how well I know your work. All right, Alexis, thank you very much.
Nice meeting you, Joey.
Yeah, nice meeting you. Thanks for the call.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.